World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dimitri Kalugin here with another week of World War Now coverage. We are well deep into the Third World War at this point. This is, I think, our second episode covering what can now be called the Third Lebanon War. We've got to talk about all the stuff going on in the Levant with Iran, with every country that neighbors Israel, of course, the United States, Russia, Turkey, Greece. Every country we talk about on the show is getting dragged into this conflict. Of course, we're going to be talking about the ground invasion in Lebanon. We're going to be talking about the impending Israeli response to the huge Iranian strike that, of course, struck Israel all over the place, really taking out a few Israeli air bases. So this is going to be big. There's rumors that it could be striking, Iran's nuclear capabilities. They could be striking their oil facilities and debilitating, the worldwide oil trade and everything. So there's a lot of things to talk about. Of course, we're going to be covering other fronts as well, talking about the U.S. election. And we're going to be, we've had some other episodes recently, some ether hours with people that we've been talking about all of this stuff. So we're going to tease those in a second. But before I talk about that, Dimitri, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. There's certainly been a lot of things taking place in the Middle East and even around the world. Today's episode will be very broad. There's a lot of points of multipolar interest that we'll definitely cover. But starting off in the Middle East, of course, there's definitely been some drastic escalations, right, following the Iranian strike against Israel and, of course, the Israeli ground invasion of Lebanon, the murder of Nasrallah, which we covered last week, all of the fallout that has come out of that, and, of course, an essentially unprecedented escalation in this particular conflict. The various international states which have reacted to it very differently. Countries like the United States have very much held back criticism, whilst we see certain, maybe predominantly Roman Catholic countries in Europe actually coming out with their condemnation of the Israeli actions in southern Lebanon, which have really shown us some powerful spine, I believe, and even the Gulf Arabic states actually coming out in more or less a neutral, maybe slightly leaning towards a negative view of what Israel is doing in the Middle East at the moment. Because again, as per Smotrich's recent interview, there is a particular goal of Israel to potentially expand its borders past its current territory, and not just to the West Bank, and of course, securing the Golan Heights, which it has already sort of taken and annexed for itself, and taking the Gaza Strip, but also expanding into what can be called perhaps the Greater Israel Project. This particular term, Conrad, has really been picking up steam recently, and the recent Greg Reese clip, which I recommend everybody watch, it's about 6 minutes long, it really goes into this Greater Israel mega Zionist project. It's more than just an Israeli homeland in the Middle East, and it expands on these potential Zionist and I would say Talmudic goals of forming this Jewish empire in the Middle East that will kind of oppose both Christian and Islamic interests and kind of work towards this futuristic kingdom of the Moshiach. But yes, basically going into recent Middle Eastern politics and the invasion of Lebanon, things are really escalating out of control. But the most important aspect, I think, of the recent exchanges between Hezbollah and Israel is that it is still very much a long-range conflict in terms of Israel actually still flying its planes over Lebanon essentially freely. We haven't heard any news of any Israeli planes being shot down. So Israel is freely bombing key targets all around Lebanon, even targeting, as we mentioned on our episode of Syrian Girl a few days ago, even targeting certain key points in Syria, actually just next door. And so Israel is essentially acting almost unencumbered in that particular capacity, but Hezbollah is retaliating. It's actually firing its missiles at, and even threatening to fire its missiles as far as Tiberias, Haifa, further south, heading towards Tel Aviv, actually. So Hezbollah has been picking up steam and actually hasn't been holding back, especially after the, I would say, murder of its leader, Sheikh Nasrallah, which the reason why it can be called a murder is because of the outright disregard for any civilian life. As we mentioned in our last week's episode, just a pure genocidal style of bombardment, the bunker busters in a civilians area, just aiming for the leader, essentially, almost like they used military styles version of AI technology to trace where Nasrallah was located, killing him. And again, this caused a lot of uproar in the world because, again, allegedly Nasrallah was heading towards a peace plan. But at the moment, Conrad, I don't think there's any discussions of any sort of peace between Israel and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. At this point, the war is definitely hot, and it's only heating up as we kind of discuss the news here.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, I don't see a peace plan coming anytime soon. We get more and more reports of high-level IRGC, Hezbollah, and Hamas leaders getting taken out by Israeli strikes across the region, Syria, Lebanon. Still things going on in Gaza, of course. That happened this week, another huge incursion by the Israelis into northern Gaza. Strikes on refugee camps. We're hearing of dozens and dozens of civilians dead there as well. So this thing just keeps on chugging along, and it seems the only people that actually have any agency and ability to act on their own will and face no resistance are the Jews. So that's where we're at. And of course, we talked with Andrei Afanasyev, which is going to be coming out after this episode. So everybody look forward to that. We also, of course, like Dimitri said, we talked to Maram. That was last week's Ether Hour. It was sort of a World War Now Ether Hour hybrid because we talk about pretty much everything we would have talked about in a World War Now episode that week. But we get into this and we get into exactly who is siding with Israel and who is going to be responding how as these strikes are going on. And of course, with Andrei Afanasyev, we talk about Russia's willingness to act in certain ways in the region, how willing they are to go to war, for example, for their ally Iran, how much they rely on certain groups within Israel and how certain people within Russia are much more reticent to get involved there. And that, of course, ties in with the Ukraine stuff. We talk about all of that as well. So stay tuned for those episodes. Click below to hear the episode with Maram. It was really good. So support the show, get behind the paywall, and get access to all of that amazing content. It really helps us out. But again, just getting right into the situation, you mentioned the fact that these Israeli jets are able to fly over Beirut, even Tripoli, all of Lebanon unencumbered, and strike wherever they want. We start to wonder, when will even places like Syria start to actually try to do something against that? Of course, Israeli jets strike Syria as well. And we know that Iran seems to be one of the only countries that actually benefits from the S-400. I believe there are some perhaps protecting Russian bases in Syria, but actual other places in Syria and, of course, Lebanon, they need those air defenses. And I don't know. I mean, it seems to me it's very obvious that Russia does not want the optics of an S-400 shooting down an Israeli jet, which I think that would be based. But it seems that there are many members of the tribe within Russia that I think would really not be happy if that happened. So that's something that we can wait for and see. But we're getting reports along the Israeli-Lebanon border that there are incursions that Israeli troops were trying to gather, that Hezbollah troops then attacked them. Missiles are being launched back and forth. We have reports from Hezbollah that now the tunnels are going to be where most of the battle takes place. They're not retreating, but they are entering the tunnels. They're fighting them into the tunnels. They're striking and then falling back into the tunnels to drag the Israelis in there, which is exactly the attritional warfare that mugged them up so badly in 2006. That is why the southern region of Lebanon, south of the Litani River and that other river, a little bit farther north, that Israeli is also asking people to evacuate north of. The reason that is still Lebanese territory is because of Hezbollah's victories in these tunnels that they are now trying to utilize, of course. But again, I don't know how tough it is on the ground for Hezbollah to be coordinating after so many of their commanders and leaders have been taken out. Same situation with Hamas, of course. Obviously, the Hamas insurgency has fallen much farther back and had to be gone much more underground and is much less effective now in Gaza as Hezbollah, I think, is going to be in Lebanon. But the real situation right now is when Israel does retaliate on these Iranian strikes, when Israel does do what it will do, whether it's the nuclear facilities like the Big Kahuna, or if it's something still big like the oil facilities or really big strikes across secret Iranian bases and whatnot, does Hezbollah still have the missile capabilities to act as Iran's sort of second strike, as Iran's sort of trigger finger near Israel that allows them to exert that pressure? Because we know Iran can use its ballistic missiles, but it can only do that in a measured way so much. If it really goes any farther, frankly, than it did in the latest strike, we know that it basically crosses the line of, acceptable back and forth in the modern understanding of things, and will trigger an Israeli response that would then drag the U.S. into it. And we know the U.S. obligation is to the Israeli Jews. So the question on how Iran has to handle this, really, the Hezbollah factor is key, because the fact that Hezbollah is right there and can launch a bunch of missiles on, Israeli territory, again, it's a proxy. It's not an actual sovereign state. It doesn't have to answer to the United Nations as much as some of these other places might. It's a very important factor. But so many of these Israeli strikes that have killed, like I said, IRGC commanders, Hezbollah, I mean, Hassan Nasrallah himself, all of these people, they've also been taking out huge amounts of Hezbollah missiles and launchers and everything. And of course, the Israelis are going to be exaggerating exactly how many of them they've taken out, but we really don't know. And we don't know if Hezbollah is eventually going to become ineffective as Iran's second strike. So we're going to be watching all of that very closely. But I think one of the other big pieces of news is that the Gulf states, specifically Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, have said that they will not allow Israelis to use their airspace for any kind of strike against Iran. And Iran has said that, yeah, if you renege on this promise, your oil facilities are not safe from strikes by us, of course, from strikes obviously by the Houthis and other Iranian proxies in Iraq and Syria. So this is very interesting. And I think we're going to see whenever this Israeli strike comes, we're going to see exactly how the rest of the region really sides and how much they're willing to put up with from Israel, and how much they're willing to support Iran just to just because they frankly have to, considering how far Israel is going.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, these oil refineries and oil depots, like when they are struck by missiles, drones, any sort of explosives, the fires are very difficult to put out naturally. I mean, it's an oil, gas, it's a natural inflammatory substance, right? So it just burns really until you really put in a lot of effort to stop it. So it's a real threat. I mean, the USSR unfortunately really failed to put some of those Romanian oil depots to fire and destroy them during World War II when the Third Reich was using them to fuel their sort of Barbarossa plan and their expansion into the USSR and that particular war. But we see in Ukraine at the moment, that's one of the Ukrainian strategies is, as we'll mention later on, the bombing of oil depots and refineries in places like Crimea, Feodosia, Rostov-on-Don, Voronezh, Belgorod, Bryansk, etc. The attacks on oil refineries and depots is a powerful aspect of modern warfare, which Iran understands that the Arab states definitely do hold that to account. And as our episode with Maram kind of discusses, one of the sort of main points about the Arabic Gulf states and the people living in the Hijaz, these elites, they're very lukewarm. They care about material wealth and their wealth comes from oil. So why would they put their own material well-being at risk, right? They like the current status quo. They like that lukewarm alliance with Israel and US. They like to balance between being Muslim and being sort of degenerate in a Western sense. And I think putting that at risk by going into a full-out war against Iran is definitely not on the cards, at least for them. I think that would be putting their interests in jeopardy. So that's one of their reasons for sort of not agitating Iran and kind of even claiming that, oh, well, Israel cannot fly their planes through our territory. But notice they did allow Israel to fly their planes earlier this year through Saudi Arabia to strike on Yemen and the Houthis, right? And those flights by Israeli planes were over, I believe, almost 1,000 kilometers. So if you count both the trip back and forth. So it's quite a long distance, which does show that these modern F-35, F-16, F-17, F-15 planes that Israel does have, they can fly these long distances because Israel, as we mentioned with Maram, it really lacks that sort of hypersonic ballistic missile technology which Iran possesses, right? So it doesn't really potentially have that capacity to launch these long-range 1,000-kilometer missiles into Iran, but it can fly those extraordinary 21st century planes and potentially drop off those very powerful bombs on Iranian strategic targets. So that's Israel's sort of go-to. And again, Israel has been hesitating to actually strike back on Iran after Iran's, of course, major missile volley over a week ago now on Israeli territories. And in fact, I believe some of the losses of Israel, Conrad, have been downplayed as well. The US has claimed that Israel and the US jointly has shot down over 200 projectiles that Iran fired. They claim that the strategic losses of Israel, including the losses of life, are a lot less than perhaps they were in reality, right? We'll probably never find out. And as we stated, I think on Telegram and on Twitter, the losses will perhaps never even be publicized until maybe there's a regime change in Israel, or perhaps Israel even ceases to exist in the future and we uncover like the reality of what took place, especially in those southern Israeli Negev desert. Some of those airports they have and those secret facilities, which is where Israel actually stores its, nuclear, these sort of futuristic nuclear technology, and possibly that's where those Israeli nuclear bombs, which we hear about a lot, are actually stashed away in those underground tunnels. Speaking of tunnels, it's almost like the year 2024, Conrad. It commenced in the Crown Heights, Brooklyn Synagogue Jewish tunnels, and it's going to end in the tunnels of Hezbollah in Lebanon, because as we know, in southern Lebanon, one of the main defensive formations, we've seen tunnels play a large role in 21st century warfare in the Middle East and Central Asia. Speaking of Afghanistan in particular, how the Taliban used tunnels against the United States very effectively, right? Hiding its particular bases, long-range missiles, arms depots, etc. And Hezbollah has been building and reinforcing these tunnels for over 18 years, right? Since the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war. And these tunnel networks, think about it, it's not like the tunnels which Hamas was building, which Israel took great efforts to actually shut down, infiltrate, and destroy. Like Hamas was building these tunnels in Gaza while under almost constant supervision from Israeli drones, United States satellites, all kinds of spyware technology. Meanwhile, Hezbollah was almost freely building these tunnels on territory which the Lebanese government and army really couldn't really intervene on. So it had the resources, it had the time to reinforce some of these underground bunkers, dungeons, and future defense structures which it can use against Israel if Israel ever forced its incursion. And this is why I think even Israel's incursion into Lebanon should be put into perspective. Like at the moment, the statistics on the ground are Israel is occupying roughly 10.5 kilometers square of the southern Lebanese territory. Comparatively, Ukraine is occupying almost 1,000 kilometers square in Kursk, right, in the Russian Federation. It's incomparable. So Israel has not taken all of southern Lebanon up to the Litani River. The battle is, we can say, almost just beginning now. So the invasion, the armored vehicles of Israel are being destroyed. Israeli tanks, in fact, are, I think, somewhat even demoralized and not even sure what they're firing at. And this is where probably the most curious story, which comes out, I think, this week, where the Israeli tank actually fired on a United Nations peacekeeping base, actually located in southwestern Lebanon. And it actually injured two United Nations soldiers. And naturally, these United Nations peacekeeping forces in southern Lebanon, we mentioned, they roughly number between, I believe, over 9,000. I think 10,000 is the official number. So there's many personnel and service people in southern Lebanon who belong to this United Nations global conglomeration. They're members of various other countries. There's Bangladeshi soldiers, Indonesian soldiers, Italian, people from all kinds of European countries, Spanish, I believe, as well. Over 50 countries have some of their recruits actually acting for the United Nations in this peacekeeping operation in Lebanon, right? They've been there since 2006, essentially, just to secure that particular area. And they've been at a sort of peaceful relationship with Hezbollah, actually not really intervening or not really fighting against them and kind of allowing Hezbollah to do their thing in southern Lebanon. And suddenly an Israeli tank fires at a United Nations interim forces watchtower, right, injuring two of their forces. The entire world reacts very drastically. And this is, I think, really shows you that Israel is possibly not even sure what it's getting into in southern Lebanon. Like, there are these massive hopes, which the rabbis speak of greater Israel, of Israeli expansion. But does Israel really have the kahunas? Does it have the arrogance to actually strike even against these international peacekeeping forces and go into a territory which is, I guess, sovereign and still Lebanese? Like, can it justify that to the international community? Or, as some people are saying, perhaps before the invasion reaches the Litani River, Israel is awaiting the sort of, shall we say, the handshake from the Moshiach's chosen one, Donald J. Trump. Of course, when he wins the election in November, and perhaps when he's inaugurated in January, perhaps he can give the green light for the entire sort of peacekeeping counter-terrorist operation in southern Lebanon to push all the way to the Litani River and to begin that massive fighting in the tunnels, which I think is commencing now on the ground, which we are hearing reports of actually Hezbollah soldiers shooting at Israelis on the ground level. Of course, Israeli tanks being destroyed. So the fighting is actually intensifying. But as we said, the majority of casualties, the majority of Israeli and Lebanese citizens being injured are, of course, from these long-range missile exchanges and Israeli planes essentially firing on civilian targets. And even Orthodox Christians are being hurt in this particular conflict. There's a lot of reports online of Orthodox Christian families, even priests being injured in some of these Israeli bombardments. So it's very concerning, I think, not just for the Shia community of southern Lebanon, which is dominant, but also for the Christians, and not just Catholics, but Eastern Orthodox Christians.
Yeah, you mentioned the long-range strikes. The long-range strike, of course, is and the strike occurred 2 weeks ago, but his body was recovered and confirmed recently. The deputy commander of the IRGC, Abbas Nilfurushan, he was killed in one of these strikes. So again, we also mentioned the head of, I believe it's Al-Quds or Al-Qassam brigades of Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hamas from Gaza. We have the deputy head of the IRGC taken out, of course, Nasrallah, all the other major heads of Hezbollah. So these are major decapitation strikes. And you talk about the fighting in the tunnels and how only 10 square kilometers have really even been taken by Israel right now. And it's important for people to remember, for anybody saying, oh, this isn't a real invasion, blah, 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 blah. Or remember what happened in Gaza, right? They never said for weeks and weeks and months that they were going to annex Gaza. The whole thing was, we're going to eliminate Hamas, eliminate Hamas, eliminate Hamas. Well, turns out to eliminate Hamas, you have to annex Gaza. So here we are right now. Israel has openly pledged to annex North Gaza. They're talking all about all these other settlement plans and this, that, or the others. So that is out the window. So just because right now the goal in southern Lebanon is the exact same thing, it's eliminate Hezbollah. Well, you can pretty much translate eliminate Hezbollah to occupy all of the land where Hezbollah has jurisdiction, which is the land south of the Litani River. So it's the exact same situation going on in Gaza, just with substitute Hezbollah and Hamas, switch them out, and they're eventually going to be occupying this place. And like Dimitri said earlier, making greater Israel. But you also mentioned the damage on the air bases from the Iranian strikes and how they were downplayed by Israel. This is a big story relating to that. The Israeli forces, the army, the police, they arrested, blindfolded, and transported 5 journalists to a military base. This is the past 48 hours. Among the journalists held is American journalist Jeremy Lafredo, who works for the Gray Zone. His phone was stolen and remains in custody. Over 24 hours later, the other journalists were released. This happened because the Gray Zone and Lafredo, they were investigating the actual consequences of the Iranian strike. And they visited the Nevatim Air Base, Mossad HQ, and they documented and showed the real damage that was going on. And some of the attempts to cover up what really happened. And so now he's been arrested and is being questioned. So the Zionist entity is really trying to keep tabs and keep wraps on what really went down to make sure that they control frame and maintain frame in this narrative so that, again, as they prepare for their strike and they prepare to try to convince the U.S. to support it, and they try to convince, for example, places like Saudi Arabia to let them use their airspace, they want to have total information control over everything that's coming out right now. And I think the situation in the Middle East in general is evolving to the point where, even countries that aren't actually going to do anything, like we said before, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, they at least have to say, like, oh, we're not going to let them use our airspace. We're not going to do this, that, or the other. Recently, Al-Sisi commemorated, the 2006 war and the reclamation of the Sinai Peninsula, or 1982 rather, and the Sinai Peninsula by Egypt, and saying that was a good thing, sort of being as irredentist and as nationalistic and as anti-Zionist as he physically can, while being bribed by the United States, but to appease the people of Egypt, who of course hate Israel. He's saying, look how great it is that we retained the Sinai Peninsula and we got it back from Israel and all of this, which I'm sure the Israelis and the Americans don't appreciate. But the question then of external support kind of comes in, and we know that the U.S. is exerting as much pressure as it can. Also on Israel, we know that Biden doesn't like Netanyahu. We know that it's been pretty clear that they had a somewhat of a red line saying we will not in any way support you striking the nuclear capabilities. But it seems now that Biden and others have been convinced to come around on a potential strike on Iran's oil facilities. So, you give them an inch and they still end up taking the mile, right? That's how it works with these people. But I think the other big player in the region, of course, and with their allies, is Russia. And if the U.S. supports Saudi Arabia and Israel, in theory, the counterbalance should be Russia supporting Iran and Syria. But unfortunately, Russia, it doesn't actually play it exactly that way. If Russia was supporting its allies in the regions as strongly as the U.S. was supporting Israel, this whole thing would be a different story. But unfortunately, Israel has a whole web of control and matrices that it works on in Russia. And Anja Kripko recently published this report, which isn't surprising considering Russia's relations with Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, and then those two countries, of course, relationships with Israel. But basically, Russia is the processor and facilitator of a large amount of Israel's current oil imports, specifically from Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, which are its two biggest sources of oil. We know Azerbaijan is pretty much Israel's number one ally, and Russia has continually shown that they're willing to side with Azerbaijan over Armenia, that they are even willing to side with Azerbaijan perhaps in the face of Iranian interests, despite how much Iran has done for Russia in the war in Ukraine and all these other things. So again, the infernal Azerbaijani lobby in Russia continues to befuddle me with how much influence they have, especially considering people like Lavrov and others are these ethnic Armenians. Not really sure what is going on there, and then when it comes to Syria, Russia, I think, needs to be much more forthcoming with its S-400s, give them to Syria and allow Iranian proxies to then transport those air defenses potentially to Lebanon and some of these other places. But all of this is off the table. And why are we even going to be considering this? Why would that even happen if we're seeing Russia completely facilitate, the actual energy that it takes to conduct these genocides and these wars? If Russia's the one processing the crude and allowing it to get to Israel, why on earth would they take these extraordinary steps to counter them in the region? So it's interesting food for thought. I think everybody needs to be realistic on where all these countries stand. And I think eventually, as Russia moves forward with new leadership, I think its support for Israel will go down. But unfortunately, right now, especially in these strict, economic sectors that aren't as flashy in the news, the back ends of things between the Jewish mafia are running like normal.
No, 100%. Like, it's not just refined oil that Russia's, of course, shipping to Israel through Azerbaijan, through Kazakhstan, and even with the assistance of those two particular nations, but also crude oil as well. Russia, notice it's Azerbaijan and Russia in particular, which are the main suppliers of crude oil supplies to Israel, which means, the key aspect here is that Israel, with Russian Azeri Caspian Sea oil, which is essentially, you can call it Khazarian oil, right? If we go back historically over 1,000 years, with those particular oil transfers to Israel, Israel will depend a lot less on those Sunni Gulf Arabic state countries, which means it doesn't have to treat the Palestinians and Muslims with any sort of reverence, because there are these sort of handshake agreements or even official cooperation agreements with, well, you trade us energy and we'll respect the Muslim population on Israeli-Palestinian territory. These agreements don't really exist. They're kind of, they're based on other things, arms trading and maybe even other style alliances, but you get it, the reliance of Israel on those Gulf states is, of course, lessened by the cooperation between Russia, Azerbaijan, and Israel, which is very unfortunate. And it does show that potentially, even despite the fact that Putin has visited Aliyev recently, this unspoken agreement between Russia and Israel is very long-standing, possibly going back to the USSR, to the regime of Stalin in the post-World War II era, and most likely will continue into the future until Russia becomes completely red-pilled on the Israeli Talmudic question. And I think, speaking of the Talmudic question, we had a really disgusting quote from Matthew Brodsky, like a former White House advisor, right? This is in regards to United Nations peacekeeping forces, which were hit in southern Lebanon. So essentially, these Warhawks in the United States Zionist lobby are essentially blaming the United Nations peacekeepers as being sort of, unspoken allies of Hezbollah. They're saying, well, they're getting in the way of Israel cleansing southern Lebanon from the presence of Hezbollah. And so he stated very openly, and I quote, Israel should carpet bomb the Unfil area in Lebanon and then drop napalm over it. It's like, okay. And we look at his name, Matthew Brodsky. As soon as I saw that name, I instantly associations with Joseph Brodsky, the Russo-Jewish poet and writer, right? That, of course, migrated from the Russian Empire to the United States. Very obvious, as well as there was another particular Brodsky character. Anyone who with the last name Brodsky just initially always strikes me as being related to this global Talmudic Zionist globalist alliance, right? So one of my friends on X, Twitter, actually posted that during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, before World War II, actually the Republican leader in Spain, his name was Juan Lopez, was actually from a devout Catholic family, allegedly, but he married a Jewish Russian exile named Maria Fidelman Brodsky. And this particular man, Juan Lopez, with his wife, Maria Brodsky, actually facilitated the transfer of all of Spain's gold reserves to the Soviet Union during World War II. And the gold was never really returned. Some of it was unaccounted for. So essentially, Spanish Catholic gold disappeared amongst the persecuted population of the USSR. We don't know where that gold went, but the last name Brodsky really does strike a very interesting connotation. It's a very globalist, very Talmudic last name. So no offense to anyone named Brodsky, but it's very interesting how that name really brings up a certain flavor in terms of world relations and some of these stories which we read about. Very interesting though, Conrad, I do want to mention a lot of people don't appreciate the fact that Israel, Russia, the strong relations which these two countries do have, they have a visa-free regime. Actually, it's been acting since 2008. And the number of pilgrims, we discussed this with Andrei Afanasyev, but Israel very much depends on Russian pilgrims, or at least depended on it before this conflict. Russian pilgrims and tourists coming from former countries of the USSR, visiting these holy places and actually giving money, like essentially spurring on the Israeli tourism industry and, using Israeli facilities, essentially fueling Israel as a country. And it shows you that pilgrimage is actually an aspect of international relations as well, because allegedly, according to statistics, in the year of 2015, more than 500,000 Russians actually traveled to Israel for pilgrimage purposes, which is quite significant. It was a lot more than, say, Russians traveling to Greece or even Mount Athos. So Russian travels to the Holy Land have always really existed as a factor, but even with the formation of the State of Israel, those relations have existed, and potentially they have been exploited by these Israeli warhawks going into the future. So, and now Russia hesitates in supporting, say, the axis of resistance in order to further its own goals because, hey, Israel has been very kind to us over the years, allegedly, right? So why should we really go against them? Yeah, so this is a very unfortunate association, which I think goes back in history.
Yeah, I think before we move on to a bit of the other front, specifically in Russia and Ukraine, I want to make sure people are aware of some of these developments. Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid called on the IDF to revive the southern Lebanon army. So this is from Visegrad, so take that for what it is, but it's an objective report. Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid has proposed reviving the South Lebanon Army, a Lebanese militia that collaborated with and helped Israel during its presence in southern Lebanon in the late 1980s and was led by General Antoine Lahad. In an article for The Economist on October 8th, Lapid argued that restructuring Lebanon's political landscape and rebuilding its army would be beneficial, reverberating the calls by IDF spokesman. He called for regime change in Lebanon, suggesting that the international community should oversee Lebanon's civilian affairs until new elections can be held and a legitimate government takes power. Where have we heard all of this before? But this also reminded me of the Cypriot-based Mount Lebanon government, which is ostensibly very Maronite, and recently leaders of the Maronite Lebanese Phalangist Party, which are ostensibly right-wing Christians, they also called basically on supporting Israel and helping to dismantle Hezbollah. So we're seeing the Israelis and the Jews really flex on and push their Christian proxies that have relevance in Lebanon. And I wonder if we're going to actually see anything with that. Will we see any people basically attack Hezbollah from behind and, work for the Israelis like that. I really hope not, because that would be very unfortunate. But, speaking of Cyprus, we know there's Northern Cyprus, and Erdogan recently, of course, talked about at the UN. He said that the UN needs to basically threaten Israel with force to incentivize them to tone down what's going on in Gaza and Lebanon. Turkey is much more interested in what's going on in Gaza. When it comes to Lebanon, they care a little bit less because Hezbollah are Shia. Again, there's much less of a connection between Muslim Brotherhood and what's going on in Lebanon than there is between Turkey, Gaza, and everything going on there. So that's one thing. But then Erdogan also began kind of seeding this idea. He said that Israel is going to attack Turkey next, and he knows about plans and this, that, or the other. And Israeli President Isaac Herzog had to come out and say, we don't have any plans to attack Turkey, which, and interestingly, you had to come out and deny it. But obviously, Erdogan's the one making the accusations. So interesting developments there. Again, we believe that's one of the most obvious things. I think anybody could predict this, that when Erdogan does fall, the new Kemalists in power are going to quickly apologize to Israel for all of these horrible, mean things Erdogan has said to them, because the Israeli authorities are literally always saying that Erdogan is trampling on the legacy of Ataturk, saying that he's, making them ashamed to have loved Turkey, and he's, trampling their secularist, liberal legacy. And we know Ataturk, I'm pretty sure he was a Jew himself, right? So it all makes sense when you come back to it. But yeah, unless you have anything else to say about what's going on in the Levant specifically, Dimitri, we can probably start talking about what is going on in Russia specifically. Not a lot of huge developments, but the Ukrainians are, of course, talking about a upcoming huge Russian offensive across the entire front line. So how are things going there?
Yeah, no, definitely. Just want to mention two really short stories, because the Houthis do deserve some slight mentions, right? So briefly, the Houthis actually fired at two more international vessels, the Olympic Spirit and the St. John. The Houthis are using long-range, they're sort of ballistic missiles, which don't really fly far, but they do manage to hit some of these key ships in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. And they, again, fly those drones, which, again, explode and damage some of these ships in a crucial capacity. And, of course, international trade in those particular waters, as we've discussed for months now, has been in quite a lot of jeopardy. As you've probably noticed, a lot of the inflation and the prices of products around the world have gone up significantly, most likely because of those actions of the Axis of Resistance forces by the Houthis. I'm not sure if that's the Houthis are to blame, but the Houthis are, again, only reacting to the genocide of the Palestinians by the IDF and Netanyahu. So that's I think, who is to blame here. But the other interesting story, I think, and this is really pivoting to Russia, Conrad, we kind of talk about this off air. I would say it's bad news, but the Russian Federation, and Lavrov specifically, has mentioned the intention of Russia to open an embassy in the city of Aden. So this is on the coast of the Gulf of Aden, where the entry into the Red Sea is, right? From the Indian Ocean. This is incredibly concerning, because Aden is the city of the Yemeni government, which it holds, and it is the opposition city to Sana'a. Sana'a is held by the Houthis, essentially the Axis of Resistance forces, and Aden is essentially like its rival city on the coast. So the Russian Federation is opening an embassy in the rival city and almost legitimizing this, I guess, liberal, pro-Western Yemeni government, right, which is pro-Saudi Arabian as well. Not sure why Russia is doing this. Again, potentially, it's almost because, well, Russia's almost weighing itself up. Well, if the Houthis do lose this conflict in Yemen, potentially, and are ousted from power, at least Russia will have a leg to stand on in terms of its relationships with Yemen. Maybe there's some sort of consideration for the fact that Russia's trying to improve its seaport relations in the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. But anyways, it is very concerning because, again, allegedly Russian support for the Houthis and even inviting Houthi representatives, right, to Moscow, and really speaking of the Houthis, not in a way of accusing them of terrorism, has been one of the sort of hallmarks of Russian international relations and diplomacy, and suddenly opening in an embassy essentially in a rival city, right, in Aden is, I think, a very major statement. So we're not sure what Sergei Lavrov's goal here is, but I think we'll find out in the coming weeks. Nevertheless, I think this is a mostly concerning and negative move by the Russian Federation. I think it's a bad idea, frankly, because the Houthis have been sort of almost a proxy ally, because remember, they are an ally of Iran, and Iran is a strategic partner of Russia, not just in the Middle East, but also in the Russo-Ukrainian war, which I think is really heating up at the moment. Like, as you mentioned, the Ukrainian commander Syrsky, and this is, again, a Ukrainian source, so he's announced that Russia has allegedly moved 50,000 troops to the Kursk front line, to Kursk, Belgorod, and Bryansk, that particular area of the Ukrainian-Russian front line. And this is major because Russia has begun pushing Ukraine back. As we mentioned, there was a slight successful Ukrainian incursion not in the particular area which we all see the maps of, that Ukrainian occupied territory in Kursk, that 1,000 square kilometers, with Sudzha being the major town city that they've captured. But just northwest of that, there was like a little entry where Ukraine has tried to take a few villages. That particular northwestern entry point of Ukraine has been completely shut down. 95% of that territory has been recaptured and re-liberated by Russia. So that's a great success. So again, there was no Ukrainian sort of wraparound, sort of flanking strategy that's taking place. So Russia has succeeded. Russia allegedly has surrounded at least 2 Ukrainian battalions, so that's several thousand Ukrainian troops. It's taken, specifically in the northwestern point of that 1,000 square kilometer breach by Ukraine, near the village of Lyubimovka, some very heavy fighting. One entire battalion has been surrounded there, and Ukrainians have been captured in the hundreds, right? So Russia is succeeding, and they're capturing like tens of villages. I believe up to 5 villages were captured just this week alone, and obviously over the last fortnight, many more villages are seeing really heavy fighting. All the civilians, of course, have left these areas and they've already been evacuated. So the civilian casualties have been decreased quite drastically. But in terms of numbers, as Syrskyi said, the Russians have increased their standing in Kursk up to 50,000 troops. Syrskyi says this is a concern for Ukrainians stationed in Kursk. The Russians are claiming that Ukrainians have up to 35,000 troops currently stationed in the Kursk Oblast, which is occupied by Ukraine. That's quite significant if you really think about it. That's almost as many as there are like Hamas operatives who really think about it numbers-wise. It's a properly armed, it's some of the best Ukrainian soldiers are actually in Kursk at the moment. And of course, they're bolstered by some of these kidnapped recruits, which Ukraine has been essentially lynching and kidnapping off of the streets and sending them in as cannon fodder. So those people are sent in the front lines, and the actual Azov battalion, Troika battalion commandos of Ukraine actually go in second. So after, of course, these unfortunate draftees and conscripts who were forcefully, of course, kidnapped by the Ukrainian armed forces are sent in as cannon fodder, and they eat up the initial rounds of the Russians. Then the Ukrainian commandos follow up, and they kind of use them as scouting. A very inhumane, very degenerate way of warfare, but this is kind of Ukraine's signature, is to use these uncommon anti-Christian strategies in warfare. That's what we've kind of seen here. But as our discussion of Andrei Afanasyev, Conrad, has gone on, Andrei did mention that Kursk, essentially for the Russian Federation, is a secondary part of the front line. The majority of those 50,000 troops that have been moved from Russia have actually been migrated from Kherson and Zaporozhye. This is why we don't hear much about Kherson and Zaporozhye in general. But the majority of Russia's key moves are taking place in the Donetsk Oblast, in particular Chasiv Yar. The fighting, like the Russians have captured a majority of Chasiv Yar, but still the city is completely decimated, such as it looks like an Avdiivka or a Bakhmut. It's quite destroyed, but Russia's still trying to force the Ukrainians out of it. As we mentioned in a previous World War now, Ugledar, that particular hilly territory, has been captured by Russia, which is a great success. And the other key city in which Russia is currently, I believe, occupying up to 55% of it is Toretsk. And Toretsk, major fighting is taking place there. A lot of civilian buildings being destroyed. Again, it's very much urban-style warfare. A lot of these tall Soviet-era apartment buildings, allegedly, they're so... When you look at like 9/11, the Twin Towers falling, right? You're almost thinking, well, these Soviet buildings, they can take real punishment because these 50-year-old, 60-year-old buildings are managing to take entire artillery and long-range drone strikes without actually falling over. And so you can see like tall apartment buildings with massive holes in them, and still you don't see them collapsing like the Twin Towers. So it's really quite interesting. The Soviet architecture really was possibly one of the great achievements of, I guess, the Soviet Union. I guess something that the Russians and the Russian Ukrainians could be proud of, because it can withstand quite a bit of punishment. But yeah, the destruction in Toretsk is quite significant, and the Russians are currently pushing Ukrainians out of there. The other great, moving back to Kursk really briefly, just near Sudzha, to the south of Sudzha, in the village of Plyokhovo, the Russians have allegedly surrounded another Ukrainian battalion. So the Russians are actually succeeding at surrounding, this is the second battalion that they've surrounded in the last week. The Ukrainians have almost not been prepared. Again, that entrance into Kursk, we've all kind of seen it as a certain demoralization strategy. The Ukrainians were not able to build long-term bunkers, trenches, any sort of defensive formations in such a short time. And as soon as Russia would gather its forces, position its artillery and its sort of armor, and begin pushing the Ukrainians back, there would be no real defensive formations or structures, which, analogously, we discussed that Hezbollah has, for example, positioned against the Israeli IDF in southern Lebanon. Ukraine has nothing of the sort located in Kursk. So once the Russians start pushing, you'll see not only large cauldrons and even smaller cauldrons forming, but you'll also see these very impressive surrounds of Ukrainian forces. But again, will that lid close over Kursk and essentially encircle tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers? Potentially. Like if Russia succeeds, this will be one of the greatest, I guess, military achievements of the 21st century, an entire sort of thousands of Ukrainian and even, I would say, NATO Western mercenaries being encircled into one massive cauldron and, of course, forced to surrender would be a great achievement, I think, for the Russian armed forces. So Russia's doing quite well. I think there's been a great improvement over the last 10 days, and October is looking very positively for the Russian armed forces. And this is despite the fact that there are still people, including the foreign minister of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, who are discussing or throwing out the idea that, well, Russia's still willing to sit down at the peace table and discuss certain things with Zelensky, or at least the Ukrainian government, which is quite curious because Zelensky is incredibly hawkish, as he's shown during his diplomatic visit to the UK recently.
We, of course, are still getting some hesitance from the U.S. to bless the Ukrainians to use all the weapons they've provided to strike at a long-range level, which the UK have, of course, blessed them to do for a long, long time now. So it makes sense why Zelensky likes to spend so much time in the United Kingdom, because they're probably his main supporters, at least in spirit. They're the ones that want to see the vision achieved the most. But I think as we see what's going on in Ukraine, the election becomes the most relevant thing. Ironically, I think for Ukraine, the election is even more relevant than what's going on in Israel, because neither Russia nor Ukraine exercise they don't hold the whip hand over the U.S. the way Israel does. So it's really going to depend on how this goes. And we see, just as we're recording this, Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, has said that he's not interested in funding Ukraine anymore. Of course, we know that Trump has said that he's going to try to end the war in Ukraine before he even gets inaugurated. At this point, I'm a little bit dubious as to Trump's real negotiating capabilities in Russia, Ukraine. I think, Ukraine has its demands, and Russia, I think, is going to try to take more and more territory. I mean, we're going to see. I hope that Russia does that. They could be stupid and try to stop this sooner rather than later. I don't know why they would want to do such a thing, but Trump, there's some who've even said, though, that Trump will just give them a whole lot of territory immediately. That's what the liberal media says. They're like, Trump is just going to give half of Ukraine to Russia immediately because he's a Russian puppet, which we know that's nonsense too. So as the election heats up, that's kind of going to be the focus when it comes to what's going to happen in the future in Ukraine. And we know that that's the most obvious Democrat-Republican split. Republicans will mean no Ukraine. Democrats will mean yes, Ukraine. But unfortunately, Trump has, he's played the game here. And when it used to be that Trump seemed as the more objectively anti-war candidate for a while, they've, you can only be against Ukraine. He's fully picked up the mantle of Israel to fill that void. And so now we know that basically the Democrats, unfortunately, are the less pro-Israel party now, with the Republicans being the main ones, because Trump has fully leaned into it. We believe he's taken the money from Miriam Adelson. He's probably going to support West Bank annexation in the future. And him and J.D. Vance are very open now about supporting huge strikes on Iran, about supporting Israel's ground invasion into Lebanon, which is horrible. And at this point, it's clear that Chabad Lubavitch themselves will be staffing Trump's 2025 White House. Jared Kushner will be advising again. And it's clear with this Iranians for Trump thing that they directly support regime change in Iran, with perhaps even installing the freaking monarchy in exile, these complete puppets. So it's really not looking good from the Republican Trump side regarding foreign policy. I know a lot of people are hating on people like Nick Fuentes and others for not being on the Trump train right now, but I'm sorry, even if I hated Nick, I couldn't do it. Like, this has been completely independent. You can go back and listen to any episode of World War Now. A year ago, we were talking about how Trump could be the Antichrist, so don't come at me talking about how I jumped off the Trump train or something. I like the guy, support Trump. There's still a good chance I vote for him. But right now, this idea that you're like not sufficiently based or this, that, the other, because you're pointing out the insane Zionist, Chabad, freaking Antichrist summoner capture of the Trump campaign and the Republican Party right now. I mean, that's just how it is. And right now, it's even important to say that it may be more important to tone down war with Iran than to tone down what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, because I think the Russians might be able to wrap that up without a huge amount of U.S. intervention one way or the other, even pulling out the current level of support. So you got to weigh these options. And again, that's the main reason why you got to be skeptical of Trump's the foreign policy stuff. And then on top of that, of course, I am skeptical that he's going to deport anybody. He's all talking about abortion and how much he loves it now, which of course I get that that's politics, but here we are. So that's kind of the state of the election right now. I don't know how Kamala seems to be, I think, realizing she can win the foreign policy thing by just not talking about it now, because before it seemed that somewhere like Michigan was going to go for Trump because Biden was overseeing the Gaza genocide, but Trump has fully leaned into being an Israel supporter, and now Kamala's on the ballot. It's not Biden. I think that's been totally obfuscated, which is crazy because not that long ago, people thought that whole Muslim contingency in some of these swing states was going to be key, but Trump's Zionism has completely washed up any advantage that he might have had in that regard. So it's pretty wild, to say the least. But I think the only other things that are going on domestically, of course, are these hurricanes. We still see the fallout from Hurricane Helene, hundreds of Americans dead across, mostly Appalachia. We're talking, western Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, eastern Tennessee. These places have been hit very hard. And of course, we had, people like Ted Cruz talking about filibustering aid because we have to send it to Israel. We have, of course, the Lindsey Graham clip with the people's houses getting swept away, people literally dying in his home state of South Carolina. And he's like, yeah, I've been out there and seen what's going on and everything, but have you seen what's going on in Israel? And it's just like, bro, like the clip they must have of this guy, man, it's crazy. But the groveling, of course, has been insane. And all the discourse online has been about whether or not this was manufactured, this, that, or the other. Of course, Hurricane Milton made landfall in Florida. People thought it was going to be the worst hurricane ever. It ended up only being like a Category 3 and then quickly dissipating to a Category 2 when it made landfall. So I don't think it's going to be anywhere near as deadly as Hurricane Helene was. I don't know the final casualty or damage control count on Milton, but either way, two very big storms, and there's rumors that others could be coming. One that may hit Texas is in the works right now. So, pray for me. We'll see how that goes. I'm not on the coast, thankfully, but we'll see what happens. But either way, whether these are manufactured or not, obviously here on the show, we know that they can make these things happen. Look into what really happened on 9/11. There was manufactured hurricanes involved. Of course, you can watch recent Gregory's clips. He talks about this as well. He's great on this issue. We know they can manufacture, create the storms. Do they do that every time? Probably not. So I haven't seen any direct evidence that this one has been manufactured per se. I'm also very open to these ideas. That being said, regardless of whether or not weather control is being utilized here, I think how it fits into the World War now perspective is that we know in all of the prophecies, especially from the modern saints, and of course reiterated by Metropolitan Neophytos, they say that geophysical phenomenon, weather phenomena, things like earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes, floods was mentioned a lot, are going to be the main thing that affects the United States during World War III, potentially even civil war. So again, the idea that foreign forces will come to the U.S. shore, I mean, that's very unlikely. And of course, that makes sense. So this could be the very beginning of some of these geophysical phenomena that we're seeing that are going to be basically the U.S. will be fighting against nature and God basically in World War III while it funds the overseas battles against Russia, against Iran, against these other places that it may agitate war against. So I think that's my perspective on the storms. Everybody has some hot take about this, that, or the other on if they're controlled. And I think you got to look past that and realize that the U.S. is being hit because we support sodomy worldwide. We support the Antichrist Zionist entity, and we support the persecution of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine.
Yeah, 100%. Like, we just have to think of a few historical examples of events which perhaps took place before the advent of modern technology, before the exploitation of nuclear technology, when the weather could not really be manipulated in sort of its modern context, right? Where we can sort of claim that, the earthquakes, for example, that took place in Syria, all the loss of life, these hurricanes, potentially, yes, they really could be utilized by some of these globalists with some of the technology they have in Alaska and other places, HARP, etc. Like, I will not be disputing any of those, potential conspirological claims because they all have a certain right to exist, I think, especially since our very own Western governments have been lying to us for generations at this point. So we really don't really have grounds to trust them. But in terms of church history, we just have to think about Saint Nikon Rozhestvensky, for example. He was an archbishop in Russia, very famous for publishing very based Orthodox Christian books. In fact, he wrote the best life of Saint Sergius of Radonezh, that famous Russian Orthodox saint from the 1300s. He wrote the best life of saint for that particular Saint Sergius, and it was actually published at the Trinity Sergius Lavra, and it's still published to this day. It's one of the best lives of saints written in the Russian language, in the modern Russian language, because essentially it's a culmination of everything we have written about that Saint Sergius, with all the miracles, various stories, and even modern interpretations. But Saint Nikon, in particular, he discusses the 1902 eruption of Mount Pelée in Martinique, France, which essentially destroyed the entire town of Saint Pierre. And Saint Pierre was located on the coast of this massive volcano in Martinique, which is an island in the Caribbean. And the reason why Saint Nikon discusses this volcanic eruption in the Caribbean so far away from the Russian Empire in 1902 is because Martinique was this very Sodom and Gomorrah-like state, this island of complete degeneracy. Allegedly in St. Pierre, its population of roughly over 30,000 people at the time, it's a small sort of colonial settlement. It had immigrants from the Caribbean, local sort of natives. It had immigrants, former slaves from Africa, as well as very high esteemed French Freemasons, which opened up very degenerate Masonic lodges. And those lodges were so progressive and so high end in terms of their degeneracy, and so almost like proto Church of Lucifer style. They had an entire Masonic lodge dedicated to Lucifer, actually, which wouldn't have even been acceptable, I think, in the, I would say, even Masonic France. I mean, to open up a lodge in the name of Satan himself was a little bit outlandish. And in fact, in Martinique, what they were doing in these particular towns, in St. Pierre in particular, was they were doing all kinds of degenerate acts. There was allegedly human sacrifice taking place. They were conducting all kinds of degenerate orgies were taking place, bestiality, things which we read about in the Old Testament in terms of what the Canaanites were doing in Canaan before holy figures like Moses and Joshua cleansed Canaan from all these degenerates and the children of Ham who essentially polluted the Holy Land, right? Which we read about in the Old Testament. This is what was taking place in Martinique. And St. Nikon says that the volcano exploded because of the sin of the people. The volcanic eruption cleansed St. Pierre because of all the sin that was taking place there. And only 2 people survived out of a population of 30,000. Even the ships in the harbor and the boats were all caught on fire and essentially burnt away. And I think it was one of the survivors was actually this young black fellow who was hiding in a prison, and he survived with pretty severe burns. But the entire city, all of the underground dungeons and basements where they were conducting these human sacrifices were all destroyed, covered in lava, ash, and melted rock. So yeah, quite staggering. And it does kind of remind us, Conrad, as you said, when we take this Orthodox Christian and even general Christian perspective on world events, on these natural calamities, they do take place because of collective sin, right? And I think this is very interesting. And because, when we speak about Martinique in particular, this island, right, with its French influence and Masonic influence, at the moment, there are really severe violent riots taking place there. So it does kind of bring us back to, remember Haiti, which we discussed earlier this year, of the cannibalism taking place there and just that broad Caribbean level degeneracy. These places are, of course, key in terms of global analysis of, say, French influence and even the influence of that post-European imperial globalist presence. The other really big, I think, event which we all read about in the Lives of Saints in the 6th century, St. Justinian in particular covered this, in particular was the plague of Justinian, as well as the volcanic eruptions which caused the volcanic winter of 536 AD. So St. Justinian essentially states that all the famines, the plagues that took place during his reign could essentially be blamed on the populations of the Eastern Roman Empire for their sins. And he says collectively, especially the sexual sins which spread throughout the empire, in particular sodomy. So apparently all these LGBTQ-related sins were spreading and gaining so-called popularity, especially in the underground, which forced St. Justinian to essentially implement very, very strict anti-LGBTQ style laws in the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire, which were very, very severe, including the death penalty, right? So that's worth mentioning. So this is one way in which Eastern Orthodox countries could enact these legislations in order to stop some of the, from God, even punishing and sobering up some of these populations which engage in these sinful behaviors. Of course, Martinique, with its Masonic French colonial government, couldn't, of course, enact any of these laws, and so the volcano destroyed the entire island and St. Pierre in its entirety, right? So which speaks a lot, I think, for Florida, right? Florida is very, despite the fact that it's Republican, it's a sort of gathering place of all these boomers, right? The retirees, people who have lived throughout that boomer generation. These are very liberal people. There are a large population of evangelicals in Florida as well. I think, Conrad, you can probably speak to that in a lot more detail. But generally speaking, we can't simply view all natural disasters as the works of the globalists. There is this aspect to it that it is in some ways a collective punishment for various populations around the world. And I think when we look at places like Haiti with its mass starvation, potentially some of the things taking place in Martinique today, and even in countries of Africa, right? Over the years, there is a huge consideration that famines, these collective natural disasters, right? The failure of crops, etc., could be attributed to just collective sin polluting not just the people, but the land itself, because we know sin has an impact on flora, fauna, and even creation, right? It kind of destroys and kills life. So a really big aspect, I think, as we pivot to sort of the African side of our World War Now analysis, is that natural disasters are not always the works of the globalists. I think, Conrad, you would agree. Sometimes it is. We do have to take accountability, and the populations we're in who are victims of these natural disasters need to, again, introspectively look upon their own deeds and how they potentially impact the world around them.
I know it's true. And I wanted to briefly talk about Martinique because it's really interesting that this has gone on. People remember for the few weeks when we were covering the New Caledonia protests that were apparently being stoked by Azerbaijan against France. We know New Caledonia is a French overseas holding, much like Martinique. And this is from the AP. It says hundreds of passengers were stranded in the French Caribbean island of Martinique on Friday after its airport was briefly forced to close because protesters overran the tarmac and tried to break in, the airport and local authorities said. The overnight shutdown backed up flights, and officials at the airport urged stranded passengers to contact the airlines for information after the facility resumed operations by mid-morning. French Interior Minister Bruno Retailleau said French authorities had regained control of the airport, which demonstrators targeted in the latest protest decrying high cost of living. Retailleau added that reinforcements were being sent. We will reestablish order. We also have to take into account local people's unhappiness about high prices. So again, this is something that rumors have already been spreading that Azerbaijan is stoking these protests as well, which it appears that Azerbaijan is committed to its plan of, giving France trouble in all of its overseas holdings. And it's just crazy that Dimitri was going to bring up that volcano story regardless. And then I remember this Martinique stuff was happening basically as we were talking about it. So it's very relevant. And these tiny islands with these overseas holdings are relevant to the transition to Africa, because the first African story I wanted to talk about was the situation with Mauritius and the Chagos Islands and Diego Garcia. So, of course, the Chagos Islands, which are British overseas holdings in the Indian Ocean, basically the U.S. pressured the U.K. this week to, I guess it was technically last week, but since the last episode of World War Now, to cede the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, which is one of those islands that's off the coast of Africa that has much higher human development than the rest of Africa because it's a largely European island. So Mauritius is going to get these Chagos Islands, but the Diego Garcia Air Base, which is this US-UK air base where a lot of things go down. It's basically the Zog outpost in the Indian Ocean where they keep everything in perspective. That's given a 99-year lease to the United Kingdom, and that's how the U.S. is going to keep using it. This has been kind of relevant in the news, of course. If people recently saw the Candace Owens interview with Ashton Forbes, who's the expert on the disappearance of Malaysian Flight 370, this is ultimately where they believe that the airplane was teleported to by the floating plasma orbs that surrounded the plane, if you see it in the video. So this is a very relevant place to the globalist stranglehold on society, and it appears that apparently the United States were the ones that pressured the UK to give it up, and I guess who knows what behind-the-scenes power struggles are going on between the UK and the US influence. We know that MI6 and the CIA clash. We know that even in Ukraine they have disagreements on basic things like who to support to take over. We know that Zaluzhny in many ways was the UK's guy. So it seems that the UK in many ways the US is in many ways triumphing over the latent, British Empire that is still trying to maintain its sort of global superpower status as, the US, Russia, China really battled these things out. But this isn't an episode about Malaysian Airlines. You can listen to the Candace Owens episode if you want to hear about that. But the major story going on in Africa is, of course, the situation in Sudan. The Rapid Support Forces are publishing all these manifestos talking about how I don't know, these guys are like terrorists. I don't understand how they think that pretending to be the victims are going to be like, we're being punished. Egypt is striking us, because apparently Egypt has supposedly been strongly now supporting the Sudanese government, striking the Rapid Support Forces. And the Rapid Support Forces lost ground and then they regained ground. So a lot of things going on in Sudan. As far as I'm aware, I believe it's the UAE that are the main supporters of the Rapid Support Forces at this point, with pretty much most of the people I know. At one point they were supported by Russia, but Russia, I think, has switched to supporting the Sudanese government since the Sudanese government has promised to give Russia a Red Sea port in Sudan. So that's very interesting developments there. Sudan has been one of the hotter fronts in World War III since this has all gone down, with huge clashes and a lot of even civilian massacres going on in Sudan. We know South Sudan, not the region, the actual country, is technically the newest country to still exist since 2011. So Sudan itself has been a hotbed of conflict for a very long time. It makes sense because it's both completely in the African world, but also in the Arab world. I think it's a member of the Arab League. It's a Muslim country. It's on the Red Sea. So it's really tied into two of these worlds where but it borders a lot of these Central African countries that are also in perpetual civil war. So it's in a very war-torn region. Also, it's Africa and Africans live there. So that's how these things kind of go down. But the other thing going on in the region, of course, is that Ethiopia is really getting ganged up on by, of course, Sudan being supported by the Egyptian government. All of its neighbors are effectively ganging up against it. Of course, Somalia, Eritrea, Egypt, and then ostensibly Sudan have basically formed this alliance against Ethiopia because Ethiopia is recognizing Somaliland as independent. It's potentially going to be getting a port there and all this, that, and the other. So I think a big question is, where is Russia going to side on that? Because on the one hand, Russia is an ally of Egypt in a lot of ways. So I think Russian-Ethiopian relations are going to be looked at, because this is a big thing happening. And they see a benefit in stoking this conflict between Somalia and Eritrea that allows them to put troops there and to intervene more, because it allows them to pressure Ethiopia on their Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, because I believe Ethiopia is wanting to fill up their reservoirs faster, which would dramatically affect Egypt's water supply from the Nile River, which they need to supply their very urbanized, huge population. Egypt had one of the fastest growing populations in the world for a very long time. So it's a big, it's all of politics right there, with, strategic warfare and resources and alliances and religious conflict. It's all happening because, again, Muslim versus Christian countries and everything. So Ethiopia, it seems like they're getting surrounded, but they do hold a lot of cards with, the river basins. But at the end of the day, the fact that they're landlocked means that they're always going to be scrounging for what all these other countries enjoy as like a basic privilege that they never even had to fight for.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's the curious thing about, South Sudan disconnecting itself from North Sudan, or I would say Greater Sudan in the north, because South Sudan is essentially landlocked now, whereas actual Sudan has the port of Sudan, which leads out into the Red Sea, which is a major trading route, which we've discussed, I think, over the last few months with the Houthis, etc., and of course the port of Aden as well in Yemen. All of this is very important in sort of world trade, international relations, and of course, even if we talk about the trade of military equipment as well to some of these countries, which Russia has been doing. Allegedly, Russia has been supplying Sudan of weapons over the last few decades, maybe going back to the USSR. And Sudan has always had friendly relations with communist countries. In particular, it had relations with China even since Mao's days. And of course, when China made the capitalist pivot in the 1970s and 80s, Sudan still sustained really good relations with China. In fact, Sudan, despite all of its neighbors, Ethiopia, Egypt, etc., and sort of supplying all these countries with oil and various other goods, whatever small manufacturing it had in Sudan. I mean, it's not a very rich country and not a very well-developed manufacturing country, but it has trade with its neighbors. But one of its largest tradees and one of its largest relationships abroad is, of course, China. And so that's very interesting when we speak about Chinese investments and influence in Africa, the Chinese loans which are given out to African countries. Sudan, is one of those recipients. And of course, we can see the civil war in Sudan, similar to the civil war in Myanmar, as sort of shall we say, like a globalist plot in order to perhaps destabilize Chinese or maybe multipolar influence in some of these countries around the world. So I think that's a very curious perspective. But again, the Nile is, as you mentioned, Conrad, like a key resource, all the way from Ethiopia through Sudan to Egypt, and all these agricultural farms depending on that river and all the fresh water that flows through it. Of course, we've mentioned natural disasters and the famines that could take place once World War III breaks out, and all the major trade routes around Europe and Asia are disrupted. I think the implications for some of these countries, as we mentioned on many, many episodes, could be disastrous. And I think not just for the Maghreb and the Sahel region, which is trying there was a really interesting article we read actually, traveling a bit to the Northwest African region, Conrad, where Morocco is actually trying to solidify a relationship with this Neo-Sahel Alliance, right, of Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and trying to build relationships with these Sahel, more or less landlocked countries, and giving them access to the Atlantic Ocean. And perhaps Morocco can, in fact, earn this sort of independence finally. Morocco is a very curious country. It does have a strong pro-Israeli lobby. Morocco, in fact, had these mini Jewish kingdoms throughout the post-Second Temple period. So it's very interesting, maybe worth some of our listeners looking into that. Some of the Jewish settlements, I'm talking about Sephardic and even like North African Jews, right? These ancient communities going back, they have held place in Morocco. So there is this sort of position where Morocco is maybe partially occupied by Jews in the highest positions, but Morocco still is looking to allow some of these Sahel countries to trade and give them access, similar to how Ethiopia requires access to the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, through Somaliland, through potentially, well, at the moment through Djibouti, which is essentially like a foreign colony country. Again, these Sahel countries would need this major trade route to the Atlantic Ocean through Morocco. So it's very interesting that Morocco is even considering that, maybe in order to agitate France, which has been triggered quite a bit through Mali cooperating with the country which opposes France very heavily, Russia, inviting Wagner over there with fighting Jenin, fighting Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the Tuareg forces, and of course the coup that took place in Niger, kind of supporting that very strongly. So very curious position of Morocco. And I think all of that North African region, I think, is very curious, especially some of these countries potentially joining BRICS in the future. There's a lot of prospect, I think, for that particular region. As long as World War III, which we're kind of jumping into at the moment, does not disrupt the development of some of these countries. But because, again, a lot of them could be set back literally decades based on what takes place. And I think some of these hot regions, such as the Middle East, between Iran, Israel, Turkey, Russia, Ukraine, etc., where most of these long-range, unfortunately, ballistic missiles will probably fly once World War III does break out. Unfortunately, I think we do need to consider that a lot of these countries, I think, are preparing. This is why the coups are taking place with such urgency, Conrad, is because these regimes, I think the people in military positions are understanding that the world is heating up. They need to secure their own countries in order to, again, bring some sort of prosperity to their people and bring them some sort of independence prior to these massive calamities, which are just around the corner. I think this is something that's prompting all of these massive, I guess, domestic changes in these Maghreb, northwest, as well as northeastern countries, including Ethiopia, is sort of lunging towards the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. It's kind of fighting for its own people. It's not really doing this in order to gain sort of material wealth, because it won't reach that in such a short time before World War III breaks out. But yeah, it really is a race for resources, a race for survival, I think, in that North African region. Yeah, quite intense.
Yeah, Africa is really becoming an intense place for proxy conflicts, kind of becoming the main battleground for proxies in many ways, it seems, because the proxies in other parts of the world have just become overt. They're not really proxies anymore. So it's very interesting. It's from the Sahel to the Horn of Africa. Things are still, of course, interesting things happening in South Africa at all times. So eyes are on Africa, but we got to shift to Asia because big things are happening there, of course. We've been covering the stuff going on in the South China Sea between China, the Philippines, and Vietnam. That stuff is still ongoing. And of course, all the normal suspects are making noise, trying to rally against China. But I think probably the biggest thing happening there right now, besides, we're going to talk about the Taiwan president's speech as well, but this from the AP, North Korea accuses South Korea of flying drone to its capital and threatens to attack next time. North Korea has accused its rival South Korea of flying drones to its capital to drop anti-North Korean propaganda leaflets and threatened to respond with force if such flights occur again. South Korea issued a vague denial of the allegations. What happened in the midst of this is North Korea has mobilized air defenses and all sorts of other weaponry to the border. All of the, crossings that are roads or bridges that do allow civilian traffic between the North and the South have been completely closed. So North and South Korea are at pretty much lowest relations since, in a very, very long time. It's looking very different from when Trump crossed that border and shook Kim Jong-un's hand. So things are going very south in that regard. And I don't know if this is some kind of pressure that China or Russia are asking North Korea to put on them, or if North Korea truly is acting in its own self-interested way. Neither would surprise me. But yeah, the Korea situation is escalating, and this comes amidst renewed calls by, Asian pro-Atlanticists as well as, Pacific hawks in the State Department and in these think tanks in Washington for a Pacific NATO, an alliance between South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and other, U.S. allies in the region. And again, this all comes amidst this big speech from the Taiwanese president on supposed Taiwan Independence Day. It was a very, very pro-American speech, very anti-China speech. And immediately, the Chinese foreign minister and everybody was responding live, basically saying that none of this exists. And there were U.S. congressmen present at the speech, and the Chinese called this an aggression. And they immediately launched military exercises and violated the airspace and everything. So it was a very interesting development. We know the more pro-U.S. candidates won the Taiwanese elections, which those are not super, easy elections to win. There's a very staunch debate in Taiwan right now. And if I was a Taiwanese citizen, I would be, frankly, irate at the amount of which the U.S. exercises control over me as an ethnic Han Chinese person. So that would be a very unfortunate reality. But it seems that the U.S. is very much leaning into Taiwan, even though it, again, directly violates U.S. policy. U.S. openly, supposedly subscribes to the one China policy, but apparently in practice, any government official can just go and recognize the quote-unquote president of Taiwan. So that's all very interesting. So Asia is very much coming into play. We talked about this with Syrian Girl as well. In a way, we do know that the best thing China could do to help Iran and Russia would be to go into Taiwan and basically open up a third front in the Third World War, like a true third front that would allow Russia and Iran to do what they need to do in their regions. But China, I think, is in many ways using the ongoing conflicts to distract their enemy and allow them to, of course, build up. We've talked about in the past how China recently at one point had 3 aircraft carriers out in the open ocean, which is the first time any country besides the U.S. has had anything close to that. So China is using the time that they have to build up to peer power with the United States to eventually, if they need to, reunify with Taiwan by force. But again, as I've said a bajillion times on the show, I believe that ultimately they want a peaceful reunification, which they still see as very much possible, which I actually agree it is more possible than Russia reclaiming influence in Ukraine ever was by peaceful means, and it's much more possible than anything going good at all without, frankly, destroying Israel in the Middle East. So I understand what the Chinese are doing.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I think even Taiwan, if we look at it from their perspective, the Taiwanese elites, of course, they have a lot of massive manufacturing industrial bases. They've kind of lived off of this relationship with the West. In fact, Taiwan, I believe, is the only country in Asia that has legalized gay marriage, to my understanding at the moment. So they've gone completely Western. And as we've said before, a certain disclaimer needs to be made here because people, unfortunately, Taiwan was one of the bases of, say, the Russian white immigration. And so Russians and even Orthodox Christians around the world view Taiwan as this potential like safe point away from communism, because this is where a lot of Orthodox Christians actually fled to after the Soviet communist revolution in Russia, as well as the communist revolution in China. Taiwan was one of those bases. But that viewpoint, I think, needs to be taken in the context of the Russian, as well as various other Eastern European refugees who actually took refuge temporarily in Taiwan during that 20th century period, because Taiwan, its history is in fact liberal Republican. We mentioned it has nothing to do with the pre-1911 China, the imperial China, which has existed for thousands of years, going back to probably the time of like Noah's children, right, when they migrated east. Then they set up the civilization of China. And the Chinese empire, its history goes back, centuries. And this new republic in China, which has established itself in Taiwan, which claims to be the original China, it in fact is just slightly older than the communist China, which we have today in mainland China. So really this particular call for heritage, which the Taiwanese president has given in his incredibly hawkish and anti-Chinese speech recently, is, I think, a bit misplaced, because we do need to, once we do our research and we just see that, what was the view, say, of the Russian Empire of the Republican Chinese leadership in 1916 during World War I? Well, in fact, 1916, Russia actually signed an agreement with Japan, this is right before the Russian Revolution, that once World War I would be over, Russia and Japan would take control of a vast majority of those northern Japanese Republican regions and actually deal them amongst themselves and actually kind of liberate them from the liberal Republican Chinese yoke, which has taken over. So this is even prior to Mao's revolution. So just considering all these political, historical realities, it's because some of these slogans are almost completely false. But what's curious, Conrad, I think, is the fact that when we speak about the Philippines, Southeast Asia, some of these Chinese coastal ships actually hitting these Filipino vessels, because we saw recently the Filipino president Ferdinand Marcos Jr. actually complained to the ASEAN political as well as economic union, which is 10 major Southeast Asian countries, including Myanmar, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, etc. It's a really important sort of economic union in Southeast Asia. It's one of the largest sort of, you can call it the EU of Southeast Asia, essentially, for some of the listeners not familiar. But Marcos Jr. essentially spoke out against Chinese aggression. He essentially blamed China for almost beginning a war in Southeast Asia, in the South China Sea, and blamed China for everything. And in fact, I think I wouldn't necessarily agree with Marcos Jr., Conrad, but I would say that China, for some reason, is almost forced to make these drastic sorties of its ships out into the South China Sea. It's almost China knows that something is going to go down in a similar way to some of these North African countries, which are making very drastic foreign political moves. What does China know about this looming threat of the Third World War, which we're in right now, and its sort of expansion? It's almost that China's trying to secure some of these shoals, some of these important territories, because it's fighting for itself rather than the interests of some of these other Western-aligned Southeast Asian nations. It's almost like a free-for-all, right? International relations, as we discussed recently, is falling apart before our very eyes. The respect for nation sovereignty as well as borders are, again, dwindling, and people are essentially nations, the people in leadership positions, various elites of countries, including the Chinese elites, are essentially fighting for themselves and for their own countries first and foremost. So that's, I think, what we're seeing. This is why I think China taking the first steps here and actually acting aggressive could perhaps be understood as China knowing what exactly is coming in the future. I think in that 2025 escalation of the Third World War, which I think we'll see very soon. We've spoken about the 2025 escalation between China and Taiwan, which is definitely coming up. The other story, I think, from Asia is very bizarre. Again, that allegedly Kim Jong-un has sent North Korean engineers to the Russian front lines in Donetsk in order to secure, remember some of those Korean missiles which North Korea gave to Russia? Well, some of these Korean missiles, a lot of the signs on them, a lot of the technology, in fact, is unfamiliar to the Russians. So they require Korean engineers and coordinators in order to fix them, in order to adjust them, and even aim them at Ukrainian military targets. So these KN-23 missiles made in North Korea and essentially made by, with assistance from China, are being regulated by Chinese engineers in Donetsk. And so a few Korean servicemen allegedly were killed in the line of battle. And so Ukraine is now claiming that North Koreans are fighting alongside the Russians, when I guess technically they are, but they're not really fighting on the front lines. They're kind of fighting, again, from in the artillery forces and the missile defense forces of the Russian Federation. So very interesting. North Korea has officially become a proper defense partner of the Russian Federation. An unexpected change, and I think an alliance that we'll see develop further.
Yeah, Asia, of course, is the least hot, I guess you could say, front, even compared to places like Africa. Of course, there's Myanmar, which again, the People's Defense Forces and the anti-junta forces continue to advance slowly but surely across the country in the low-grade civil war that continues to go on. Of course, the reason it's more confusing is because it's not really just one force versus the government. It's like 6 forces versus the government, and sometimes the forces align and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they fight each other. But yeah, the situation in Asia is less hot, but it could change at any moment to becoming the hottest front, because it is, of course, China versus USA is kind of the big kahuna of world clashes that in theory could always come about. So we're always watching it, but we got to talk a little bit about Europe, and then I'll ask Dimitri about the persecutions going on in Ukraine, and we'll wrap this thing up. We know in Europe that in many ways they're growing weary of the situation in Ukraine. Viktor Orban and Hungary have assumed the presidency of the European Union, which is not making the bureaucrats of the Commission happy. Ursula von der Leyen and these other, all the EU people and these others, for people from Germany and these other countries, are talking about how, Orban's vision of toning down the war in Ukraine and not welcoming migrants is not, what they agree with and everything. But unfortunately, that's not how the people of Europe feel. We see the Freedom Party of Austria securing a legislative win in Austria, a big far-right win in Austria apparently for the first time since World War II. I don't know if that's even an accurate headline. And we, of course, in the past have talked about the AfD victories very recently, and we see Meloni doing well in Italy still and all these other places. So very much, the people of Europe are rising up against the mass migration and all of these other things. And the situation in Ukraine seems to be kind of on the chopping block in that regard, because the German economy, all these other places, it's really getting bad. Everybody is aware of the fact that the United States has completely prevented a future united Europe from being any kind of economic challenge to the US. They have completely, subjugated them basically to the United States empire, the UK included, like we were talking about earlier with the dismantling of their little latent empire. But it seems that in many ways, the European partners might also be willing to turn down their support for Ukraine. I think the UK in that regard will be on till the bitter, bitter end. But if Trump wins, he'll definitely be leaning on the European partners to tone down the support there. And at the same time, certain European countries are more willing to support Israel. Germany is literally just like a gun to its head supporting Israel. Meanwhile, countries like Spain and other countries are very, very willing to support Palestine. So it'll be interesting to see how, Hungary, of course, as well, is very pro-Israel. We know that's kind of the big Putin, Orban, Netanyahu. That's kind of the Eastern European, quote unquote, based national conservative, Zog Jew connections. So we're watching all of that very closely, but I guess it counts as European news, unfortunate European news with the situation in Ukraine and the persecutions. Dimitri, what exactly is going on?
Yeah, I think the craziest development was this really strange character. We can even call him the anti-Strelkov, right? So he's essentially the same age as Strelkov, maybe a bit older. He's 60 years of age. His name is Dmitry Korchinsky. And this is a really interesting character worth reading about. Essentially, just as Strelkov participated on the side of the Russian Federation in some of the wars, in the Chechen wars, in Transnistria, Pridnestrovia, in Bosnia, fighting for Serbian interests and all these other conflicts in favor of the Orthodox Christians, Korchinsky fought on exactly the opposite side in almost all of these conflicts. And he was a very big Ukrainian nationalist proponent, even in the late USSR period. And so this particular guy actually participated on the Chechen side, actually fighting for the Ichkerian terrorists of Jahar Dudayev in the first Chechen conflict against Russia. And so this particular character, you can kind of see his background. He, in fact, is still very active in Ukraine. In fact, he ran for a few presidential elections throughout the early 2000s, leading up to the Maidan. He's called one of the key sort of neo-Nazi Banderite figures in the pro-Ukrainian movement. He claims to be an Orthodox Christian, but he, of course, belongs to the schismatic Epiphany Church. And openly, he has proclaimed that he will be putting together these groups of 100 commandos, these militiamen, essentially stormtroopers, in order to secure and take key Orthodox Christian churches and monasteries away from the Moscow Patriarchate Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And he says that it will take roughly 100 Ukrainian militia commandos per oblast in Ukraine in order to secure and take possession of all these churches, essentially taking parish by parish, cathedral by cathedral, monastery by monastery, conducting these secure raids on every oblast. So roughly it says that he needs to put together, 2,500 men, roughly. And if he can do that, then he can essentially destroy Orthodoxy across all of Ukraine, which he claims this is the Russian Orthodoxy, but this is in fact canonically Orthodoxy, which he's waging a war against. So very evil, Dmitry Korchinsky, very evil character. And these are some of the key menacing figures in Ukraine at the moment. And he's a layperson as well. So very, very dangerous. But besides Dmitry Korchinsky's sort of provocation and his sort of open statement, what we've seen in Ukraine is, of course, a great deterioration of just Orthodox public relations, I can say. There's been a few priests who are, in fact, kidnapped, you can say almost lynched off the streets and taken to these Ukrainian conscription training camps because they were forcefully recruited into the Ukrainian military. In particular, we have the names of 4 priests which have been reported. This is Archpriest Basil Rahana, Father John Polishuk, Father John Kruis, Father Vladimir Petrovitsia. And Father Vladimir, actually, interestingly, he escaped from the recruitment military camp and he began hiding in the homes of one of his parishioners, right? Eventually, the Ukrainian armed forces on the 3rd of October found his location, captured him, and now he's facing up to 12 years in prison for deserting the Ukrainian armed forces. So prayers for Father Vladimir at the moment because he's facing prison time. But these other priests have been unheard of since they've been essentially stolen from their dioceses, from their parishes, from their church communities, and forcefully recruited. We don't know what they're doing to them in these military camps. And these sort of forceful recruitments of Orthodox Christian priests and forceful conscriptions, I think, is one of the ways in which Ukraine is currently persecuting Orthodox Christianity. So this is like one of these particular elements. Again, recruiting laypersons as well, related to the church. This is a very Bolshevik communist strategy, which we remember the Bolsheviks and the communists, they didn't only harass and target Orthodox Christian priests and clergy people, but also their relatives, their cousins, their children, their wives. I mean, it's really horrifying, but there was actually a New Martyr Life, which I read a few weeks ago. In fact, this particular priest, before he was sent to the Gulag, he blessed his wife to leave him. He actually divorced his own Matushka wife in order for her and his children to actually survive the persecution of the Bolsheviks in the late 1920s. It's the only divorce that I've seen a saint actually go ahead with, because he was being sent to a camp and he knew that if his wife was still married to him while he was being sent to a Gulag, she would be harassed and essentially martyred as well. So he saved her life and the life of his children. Before he was sent to the Gulag, he essentially divorced his own wife, or at least willingly went for that. Again, this is like horrific, right? Stories which we read about, and this is what we're seeing in Ukraine. The example of this, right? We're speaking about relatives of Orthodox Christian clergymen. We saw one of the adopted children, I believe this young man was in his 20s, of Metropolitan Longin Zhar, the long-suffering Metropolitan who has been harassed, beaten, imprisoned. I mean, who knows? He's had heart surgery from the heart attacks and all the stress which he's endured, from the absolute harassment on his monastery and his people in his particular area of tenureship, right, in Ukraine. And Metropolitan Longin's adopted son was actually taken by the Ukrainian armed forces. And those videos were released. I think, Conrad, we all saw them. We published them on Telegram, where his son was essentially just kidnapped right in front of him. And he was crying outside, asking the Ukrainian conscriptors not to take his son. He said, I've already had 2 of my adopted children die in this particular war because they were forcefully recruited. He says that this war is not, we shouldn't be sending young Ukrainian men out to die in the trenches against Russia. But still, the Ukrainian war machine, this degenerate construction of NATO and the Chabad, continues to churn through the Ukrainian Christian population. And this is how it's done. Sometimes, the particular victims of it, again, are very closely related to the church. So it's just one of these demoralization strategies, which are very obvious. And the spreading of, degenerate cults and sects is very obvious as well. There's been recently a lady has gone viral on Ukrainian internet, which, if you can imagine, just the statement Ukrainian internet already sounds a little bit scary and demented. This particular woman, her name is Gana Fesun. It doesn't sound very Ukrainian. It's almost, shall we say, a little bit Chabad related, a little bit Talmudic. So this woman, she seems to be in her late 30s. She's proclaiming herself as the incarnation of, and I mean, this is very blasphemous, but the Virgin Mary. And she's filming clips, TikTok videos outside of Orthodox churches asking for people to donate to her and that she will pray over them. Apparently, the Ukrainian police, there's been several Orthodox Christians have tried to shut this woman down because she's claiming to be the mother of God and asking people for donations. She's started an entire cult. It's almost like these very weird sectarian movements we see in the West. But in Ukraine, apparently even this woman whose husband is in a coma from a military accident in the war with Russia, she donated her entire bank account, all her savings, and even took out Ukrainian credit cards and went into debt in order for this fraudulent woman to pray over her husband so he would awaken from his coma. And this woman went completely bankrupt. And the Ukrainian police have refused to shut this Gana Fesun woman down because, again, they're claiming that she's just asking for donations, for voluntary donations. She's not fraudulently extorting people or robbing them. And so those Ukrainians who are desperate, who essentially have been brainwashed over generations, and even now, I think over the last 2.5 years, very intensely, are falling for some of these frauds who are acting and essentially pretending to be literally living saints in the Ukrainian heartland. So it's quite horrible. So yeah, the persecution is very much headed towards some sort of crescendo, right? At the same time, we hear, very unfortunately, there are these canonical pro-Ukrainian bishops, in particular Bishop Jonah Abukhov, who is one of the Vicar bishops of Kiev. In fact, he's the head of the youth commission of the Ukrainian Orthodox Synod. This is completely canonical structure. So Bishop Jonah not only is he pro-Ukrainian, he's been putting together these massive donation gatherings for the Ukrainian army and actually promoting the militarization of the Ukrainian society. And he's quite a young bishop, he's only 52 years of age. But Bishop Jonah, I think, just really concerning as to why this bishop would be promoting such actions. At the same time, on the Russian side, we have very positive developments. We've seen Bishop John, this is, of course, on the other side of the war front, Bishop John of Belgorod has been baptizing en masse Russian militiamen, Russian soldiers, catechizing them. So even the Bishop of Belgorod himself is actually promoting orthodoxy. And this is the difference, right, between Russia and Ukraine, Conrad. We keep reiterating it, but it's just becoming more and more obvious. The Russians are not persecuting orthodoxy. They're actually promoting it. They're promoting Christianity, Christian values, despite all of the geopolitical and foreign political shortcomings. And even the Chabad, recently we mentioned how the Chabad has finally, through Rabbi Alexander Boroda, have found an influence in the National Guard of the Russian Federation. These, of course, are issues, but the Chabad, of course, would only have minimal influence on Russia. We know Orthodoxy is predominantly the thing which runs the Russian military. We see the Orthodox Christian flags. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, I recommend everybody listen to our 8th hour episode with Andrei Afanasyev. He very clearly states that the Ukrainian military is not allowed to have Orthodox Christian chaplains who are members of the canonical church. Only those who are in schism or members of these various other sects and cults or Roman Catholic prelates and priests are allowed to be participating and working together with the Ukrainian military. So the entire Ukrainian military is being de-Christianized in order to, I suppose, promote some of these atrocities which we see in places like Kursk, etc. I mean, this is a very top-down, I think, evil strategy which they're using here. But yeah, I think in the end, the forces of evil will not be victorious, and Russia will hopefully come out on top so that it can not only improve itself, but also assist some of these suffering people. Of course, the last story, Conrad, we need to mention is, of course, Metropolitan Arsenius of Svyatogorsk Monastery, the monastery which we speak about quite a bit. He's been detained for another 2 months. He's still facing a prolonged trial, which may lead to almost a decade of detention for him, incarceration and prison time for allegedly assisting the Russian military against the Ukrainian military, which are just fraudulent claims. I'm not sure how this case is even moving along, because he essentially, all he did was state that the Ukrainians are blocking the roads leading to his monastery in one of his sermons. And this apparently has him cooperating with the Russian armed forces, simply mentioning the fact that the Ukrainians have set up a roadblock on the way to his monastery, which is in the Donetsk wilderness, right near a river in the mountains where there's only one road leading there. So, I mean, come on. So yeah, that's the persecution, I think, in a nutshell. And almost every week we hear about these priests being persecuted, their families being destroyed, and it's quite disheartening. But we know in the end, Conrad, the forces of evil will be defeated, and I think this is what we understand. The Andrei Afanasyev episode, by the way, which I keep quoting and referencing, is a great example of just a hope-filled discussion we had with someone who's been to the front lines and someone who stated very openly and clearly that he believes victory will come very soon as a few months away.
We'll stand by for that. Be sure to get behind the paywall, support the Ether Hour and everything at worldwarnow.co to in a few days when you're listening to this. Well, it may already be out depending on when you're listening to this, but that will be forthcoming very soon. Really great conversation with Andrei Afanasyev, great friend of the show. So we're very much looking forward to that. Be sure to subscribe. It'll all be linked below regardless of where you're listening. But I'm going to read one final story here. This is good news from the church. I know we talk about a lot of bad news at the end of the show regarding the church, but this is some good news. In a message, Patriarch John of Antioch conveyed his deep appreciation to Patriarch Kirill of Moscow in response to a message of sympathy following the recent military escalation in Lebanon. The correspondence from Patriarch Kirill expressed solidarity with the Lebanese people amidst the turmoil in the Middle East, offering support and prayers during a time of heightened tension. In his reply, Patriarch John X expressed gratitude to the Russian Church for their compassion and support during these challenging times. The Patriarch's letter read, "I received with great emotion and appreciation your message of sympathy, in which you expressed your heartfelt solidarity and sincere feelings after the recent escalation in the Middle East and Lebanon in particular. I thank you for your noble feelings and raise my prayers with you to Christ, the Father of lights, to establish his peace in the hearts, console everyone, and have mercy on the souls." Patriarch John X further emphasized the shared hope for peace in Lebanon, highlighting the devastation that war brings to humanity, which is called to reflect the image and glory of its creator. He wrote, "I also lift my prayers for peace in your region, asking the Lord of peace to extinguish the fire of war that is killing man, while man is called to be in the image of the glory of his creator." The letter concluded with a prayerful blessing for the Russian people and the Russian Orthodox Church, expressing support for Patriarch Kirill's leadership. May God protect the Russian people and the Russian Church and assist your hand as you lead the Russian Church enlightened by the light of his holy gospel. So, great amounts of unity being seen between the Russian Church and the Antiochian Church. You know, the two churches that me and Dmitry are a part of. So real World War now unity is being seen. So this is great. Of course, being centered in Damascus, I'm glad to see that Patriarchate of Antioch is not acting as a fifth column and is, you know, much like it should be, very close to the largest Russian Orthodox country in the region, is very much an ally of the Russian Orthodox Church and is not acting against the government of Bashar al-Assad, orthodoxy in the region, or in any way on the behest of Israel. So it's great to see. So before I do the plugs, do you have any last words, Dmitry? Because I think that's a good way to end the show.
No, absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for your support. I know we've had some great interviews coming out where we'll be sure to release some articles before the end of this year. We even have some really great ideas on how to expand some of the World War Now informative 8th hour episodes, right? We know we've had really amazing feedback on the St. John Vatatzes, Marble Emperor, episode 1, episode 2. So I think we'll be working with our good friend Mr. Hears on developing possibly further episodes about Roman Orthodox emperors, right, going into the future, discussing some of their history, especially the Orthodox imperial saints, which, again, don't have much coverage, and there's definitely almost no podcast episodes on them available online. So we'll be getting in depth on some of those possibly in early 2025 as well as maybe late 2024. So look out for that. And definitely check out our latest episode with Andrei Afanasyev in terms of coverage of the Russian war front. I think that is key to understanding what is taking place in terms of global geopolitics. And Andrei Afanasyev was very kind in terms of giving us his time and actually insightfully giving us some of his high-level analysis. And very much he spoke a lot freely on our show than even in some of his interviews on Russian media channels. I think he really poured his heart out for us and as well as yourselves, our listeners. So definitely check out that 8th hour episode.
Yeah, Andre, he really likes coming on the show. So we're going to have him on more in the future because he loves talking about the things we talk about. So click the link below. Listen to the Ether Hour we recently did with Maram about World War III in the Middle East and Lebanon. Get behind the paywall so that when the Andrei Afanasyev episode drops, you will already be there. You'll get it in your inbox and you will be able to listen to it right off the bat, as well as 50 plus other episodes about history, about geopolitics, about controversial topics like pogroms, the foundations of the Holy Land, the saintly emperors of the past 150 years of the Romanov dynasty, iconography with special guests like Shane Swenson, all sorts of other content. So get behind the paywall, worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. It's linked below wherever you're listening to this. So please do that. It really supports the show. It keeps everything going. So do that if you haven't already. Leave a comment, like the video or the audio, wherever you're listening. Again, like and share. It always helps. With all of that, be sure to follow us on X, World War Now _ I'm on X as well at GnomeRad. Be sure to follow me there. Dimitri's at OCanonist. We're on Telegram as well, World War Now Telly. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're going to be doing more live streams there. Check out, of course, the live stream we did a few weeks back with Father Peter Heers, David Erhan about the Mount Athos trip we went on. A lot of great stuff going on there. So be sure to subscribe to all of our channels. Like I just mentioned, the Telegram, World War Now Telly, is a great place to keep up 24/7 with the news. So follow us everywhere. It really supports the show. worldwarnow.co. Get behind that paywall if you really want to help us out and get, again, access to really some of our best content. So again, thank you so much for listening, everybody, and God bless. We'll see you on the next one.